In 2014, the CEO of Sony Pictures made a decision in a single afternoon that triggered one of the worst corporate hacks in American history, dragged North Korea into a diplomatic standoff with the United States, and exposed the private health records of his own children to the entire internet. Around the same time, his best friend had already lived through his own public humiliation a decade earlier. A personal diary that ended up quoted on the front page of the New York Times during a presidential scandal. For more than 20 years, these two men never talked about what happened. Not to each other, not to their families, not to anyone. Then, during the pandemic, on a cold beach walk, they finally did. And what started as two old friends confessing their worst moments turned into a book that argues something most of us have never considered. Your mistakes are not random accidents. They follow patterns. They have a backstory. And if you're willing to look at them honestly, they can tell you more about who you are than your greatest achievements ever could. This is From Mistakes to Meaning by Michael Lynton and Joshua Steiner. And today we're breaking down every part of it. Let's start with the core idea, because it reframes everything. Most of us treat failure and mistakes as basically the same thing. The authors say they're actually opposites in disguise. A failure comes after careful planning, hard work, and a genuine attempt at something difficult. Think of an expedition that doesn't reach its goal, or a startup that does everything right and still goes under. A mistake, by contrast, is a decision made without careful thought or self-awareness that leaves you with regret. Nobody plans to make a mistake. That's exactly why it stings so much. And here's the twist. Every serious mistake, the authors argue, follows a 3-act structure, just like a movie. Act 1 is everything that happened in your life before the decision. Your history, your habits, your unresolved stuff. Act 2 is the moment itself, the few seconds or minutes where you actually mess up. Act 3 is what happens afterward, how you process the regret, the shame, the fallout. Most of us only ever talk about Act 2. I said something stupid. I made a bad call. But the authors insist that Acts 1 and 3 are where the real story lives, and ignoring them is exactly why mistakes keep haunting us for years. To understand why our past shapes our mistakes so powerfully, the book introduces a concept borrowed from psychology called a schema. Think of it as a mental template you build over your lifetime, based on everything you've experienced. It's how your brain decides what to notice and how to react to it. The authors describe a famous experiment where people were told to wait in an office before a study began. Afterward, they were asked to recall what was in the room. People consistently remembered objects that weren't actually there because their brain had a template for what an office should contain, and that template overrode reality. Schemas work the same way with people and situations. If you grew up believing punctuality equals respect, you'll feel disrespected every time someone is late, even when traffic is the real culprit. If you grew up feeling like you constantly had to prove your worth, you might overreact to a small slight in a meeting decades later. The danger isn't having schemas. Everyone does, and we need them to function. The danger is not knowing you have them, because then they quietly steer your decisions without your permission. The authors borrow a great line from David Foster Wallace about two young fish swimming along, encountering an older fish who asks how the water is, and the young fish later wonder, what the hell is water? That's how invisible our schemas can be. We're swimming in them. Now let's get into the actual mistakes, starting with Michael's. In 2014, Michael Lynton was the CEO of Sony Pictures, sitting in on a table read for a new Seth Rogen and James Franco comedy called The Interview, a movie about two journalists recruited to assassinate North Korea's leader. Normally, greenlighting a movie at Sony took months of careful, multi-department analysis. But that day, the actors were hilarious, the room was electric, and when the read-through ended, the studio head jumped up and said, "Let's make this." Michael, caught up in the moment, agreed on the spot, abandoning every safeguard his studio normally relied on. 12 months later, Sony was hacked by North Korea in one of the most damaging cyber attacks in corporate history. Confidential emails, social security numbers, unreleased films, even Michael's family's private health information were leaked online. The fallout consumed his life for months, strained his relationships with his employees, and even led to a public clash with President Obama over how Sony had handled the crisis. So why did a famously cautious executive throw out his own process? The book digs into Michael's childhood. He grew up as an awkward, friendless kid in Holland after his family moved there from New York, watching from the sidelines while other kids partied without him. Decades later, sitting in that Hollywood table read surrounded by A-list actors, that old desire to finally be one of the cool kids took over. He wasn't just approving a movie. He was, for one fleeting moment, getting invited to the party he'd been shut out of as a child. The book ties this to real research, including the famous Asch conformity experiments, where the majority of people will go along with an obviously wrong answer just because everyone around them says it's right. Michael's mistake wasn't really about North Korea or comedy scripts. It was about belonging. Joshua's mistake happened 20 years earlier, when he was a young chief of staff at the Treasury Department during the Clinton administration. As a habit from his backpacking days in his 20s, Josh kept a personal diary. The problem? He kept writing in it the same casual, unfiltered way during the Whitewater investigation, including secondhand gossip and unflattering remarks about his colleagues' reactions to a politically explosive scandal. When he was subpoenaed, he initially tried to hide the relevant pages, then came clean, handed them over, and ended up testifying before Congress on live television, with senators reading his private diary entries out loud. The book is clear that keeping a diary wasn't the mistake. Plenty of people do that safely. The real issue was a habit that worked perfectly well backpacking through Asia, completely failing to translate to the high-stakes, politically charged environment of Washington. What worked in one context became a liability in another. And what made it worse wasn't even the diary itself. It was what happened afterward. Josh spent years avoiding anything that reminded him of it, changing the subject whenever it came up, essentially trying not to think about it. The authors connect this to a famous psychological finding. The harder you try not to think about something, they call it the polar bear effect, the more it forces its way back into your mind. Suppression doesn't make shame disappear. It just makes it fester. From here, the book shifts into a series of interviews with other accomplished people about their own buried mistakes, and each one reveals a different psychological pattern. There's Tony Schwartz, a respected leadership coach, who once grabbed a phone out of an audience member's hands mid-speech, accusing him of disrespectfully multitasking, only to discover the man was a wounded veteran reading lip-sync captions of the talk because he was hard of hearing. Tony's reaction wasn't really about that one audience member. It traced back to his own childhood feeling of being overlooked and needing to prove his worth. There's Rosanna Kapeller, a brilliant scientist who left a stable job after being passed over for a promotion, took a role at a startup without doing proper due diligence, and ended up working for an abusive, controlling boss for years, nearly destroying her marriage and her health in the process. The book traces this back to her childhood in Brazil, where, as the oldest of 5 kids with 2 self-absorbed parents, she effectively became the parent of her parents. Psychologists call this parentification, and it left Rosanna with a deep, unconscious familiarity with controlling relationships, which is part of why she stayed in a toxic job far longer than she should have. There's David Frankel, the director behind The Devil Wears Prada, who, riding high off 2 huge box office hits, convinced the studio to spend $45 million on a quirky bird-watching movie called The Big Year, which grossed under $8 million. David had built his whole identity around being an outsider who didn't play the Hollywood game, a trait inherited from his father, a Holocaust refugee who never wanted to join the club. But that same outsider instinct, which had once helped David make brilliant creative bets, blinded him to the fact that studio executives don't actually mean it when they say whatever you want to do, we'll support. There's Carol Mason, a senior Obama-era Justice Department official, who left her nephew alone during what seemed like a routine traffic stop, only for the situation to escalate terrifyingly, with police dogs and backup units called in over a seatbelt violation. Carol had assumed a kind of racial affinity with the officer, who was also black, and figured everything would be fine. The book uses this story to explore how even our positive assumptions about people, affinity bias, can lead us badly astray, and how the weight of being a first in your field can make it almost impossible to use your own influence, even to help someone you love. There's Joanna Coles, the media executive who transformed Cosmopolitan magazine, whose biggest regret wasn't a scandal at all. It was not having more children. The book explores how an entire generation of ambitious women absorbed the message, from feminism and from corporate culture alike, that having kids would derail their careers, only to realize later in life that family, not work, was the deepest source of meaning and connection. There's Irv Gotti, the legendary music producer behind massive Jennifer Lopez hits, who, in the same hour he'd been hit with a racial slur from a powerful record executive, took an unrelated call from an Elle magazine reporter and trashed J. Lo in print, instantly destroying one of the most valuable creative partnerships of his career. The book calls this displacement, taking an emotional reaction meant for one person and dumping it onto someone completely unrelated. There's Mabius, a hardworking former teacher and baseball wife who, desperate to feel like she belonged in her wealthy new community, invested nearly her entire net worth, over $900,000, in what turned out to be a Ponzi scheme run partly by people from her own church. There's Michael Govan, the director of LACMA, who gave up being a working artist for a high-powered museum administration career in his 20s, and still, decades later, wonders what might have been. And there's Liz Jenkins, a CFO at Reese Witherspoon's production company, whose first major hire, driven by fear of her own perceived weaknesses, turned out to be completely wrong for the role, despite having the most impressive resume of any candidate. Across every single one of these stories, the same pattern keeps showing up. A mistake that looks small or even understandable on the surface, traced back to a schema formed years or even decades earlier, often in childhood, that the person never knew was running the show. So what do you actually do with all this? The book offers a practical framework called DUET: disclose, unpack, empathize, and trust. Disclosing means actually saying the mistake out loud to someone, starting small if you need to. Unpacking means asking why repeatedly, similar to the famous 5 whys technique used by Toyota engineers, to dig past the surface story to the real root cause. Empathizing means approaching what you find with curiosity rather than judgment, creating what psychologists call a holding environment where you can actually look at uncomfortable truths without flinching. And trust means believing that the people you open up to, or even just yourself, won't use your honesty against you. The book also offers practical strategies for making fewer mistakes in the first place. Take a cheetah pause before reacting. Cheetahs are remembered for their speed, but their real superpower is their ability to slow down and reset. Balance your gut instincts with deliberate thinking, because research consistently shows that pure intuition and pure overanalysis both lead us astray. The best decisions blend both. And don't go to sleep angry at yourself or someone else, because an apology delivered quickly and sincerely diffuses far more damage than most of us realize. The book closes with one of its most powerful images: kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, so that the cracks become part of the object's beauty rather than something to hide. That's ultimately the argument of this whole book. Your mistakes aren't flaws to bury. They're the cracks where the gold goes in, and once you understand why they happened, they stop having power over you. If you've ever carried around a mistake you've never told anyone about, this book might just give you the framework to finally look at it differently. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit subscribe for more deep dives into books that can genuinely change how you see yourself. And let me know in the comments, what's a mistake you've never really unpacked?